In December of the year 1876, Peruvian fishermen in the port of Paita noticed an anomaly that was soon to shake the entire world. The water along the coast, which should have been cold and filled with plankton at this time of year, was unusually warm. Local nets were missing their usual catch of anchovies, and instead of dry coastal mist, heavy dark clouds gathered in the sky. The fishermen called this mysterious phenomenon El Niño, the Christ child, because it regularly appeared around the Christmas season. They had no idea that this warming was not just a local inconvenience. It was the beginning of a global climate monster. Thousands of miles away in the Indian province of Madras, millions of peasants at the exact same time stared desperately at a scorched sky from which not a single drop of monsoon rain fell. The worst environmental disaster in recorded human history had begun, one that would weave Pacific waves together with colonial cynicism and wipe out 3% of the global population at the time. 150 years later, climatologists are returning with a warning that sends chills down the spine. According to the latest satellite measurements and atmospheric models from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a new, extraordinarily powerful El Niño cycle officially began in the equatorial Pacific Ocean in May 2026. Climate projections indicate that this event could rival the most extreme occurrences in history in terms of intensity. This time, however, this Pacific climate giant is not entering a stable environment. Instead, it is merging with record-high global temperatures driven by human activity, setting the stage for extreme weather anomalies that modern civilization has never before experienced. Anatomy of the Pacific Weather Engine. To understand why this cycle is so dangerous, it is necessary to untangle the complex ocean-atmosphere mechanism that scientists refer to as the El Niño Southern Oscillation. This system operates as a massive planetary heat pump. Under normal conditions, strong easterly trade winds blow along the equator, pushing warm surface water westward toward the coasts of Indonesia and Australia. This process allows cold, nutrient-rich deep water to rise to the surface along the coast of South America, a phenomenon known as upwelling, which feeds the planet's richest fishing grounds. During El Niño, however, this order completely collapses. The easterly trade winds weaken or even reverse. The warm water accumulated in the western Pacific begins to surge back toward the east in the form of massive waves beneath the sea surface, known as Kelvin waves. In the year 1969, the Norwegian-American meteorologist Jacob Bjerknes was the first to describe the physical principle behind this phenomenon, known today as the Bjerknes feedback. This is a closed positive feedback loop. The weakening of the trade winds leads to the eastward displacement of warm water, which reduces the temperature difference between the eastern and western Pacific. This reduced gradient weakens the Walker circulation, the atmospheric cell discovered by Sir Gilbert Walker in the 1920s, which in turn causes even greater weakening of the trade winds and further warming of the ocean. Klaus Wirtke later refined the oceanographic component of this cycle in the 1970s. He discovered that prior to the onset of El Niño, strong trade winds literally pile up warm water in the western Pacific Basin, raising sea levels there. When the trade winds suddenly slacken, this accumulated mass of warm water rolls back to the east like a giant pendulum, pushing the cold thermocline deep beneath the surface and blocking the life-giving upwelling. We can divide this entire process into three basic phases. In the neutral phase, the temperature anomaly in the eastern Pacific is close to 0 degrees Celsius. With standard easterly trade winds operating, the main zone of atmospheric precipitation located over Indonesia, and stable upwelling supplying the marine ecosystem with phytoplankton. During the warm El Niño phase, the temperature anomaly reaches from 0.5 degrees Celsius to more than 2 degrees Celsius above the long-term average. Trade winds weaken or reverse. Precipitation shifts over the central and eastern Pacific, and the suppressed upwelling triggers a collapse of the food chain. Conversely, the cold La Niña phase represents the opposite extreme, where the temperature drops more than 0.5 degrees Celsius below average. Trade winds are extraordinarily strengthened, and they bring cold, nutrient-rich waters along with enhanced upwelling. Ecosystem collapse, lessons from 1972. The consequences of disrupting this Pacific weather machine were dramatically demonstrated in the year 1972 off the coast of Peru. At that time, Peru was the largest fishing nation in the world. With its local industry built on catching billions of tiny anchovies, these fish thrived precisely because of the cold upwelling that brought plankton to the surface. However, due to overfishing in the 1960s, when catches exceeded 13 million tons annually, despite scientists' warnings of a sustainable limit of 8 to 9 million tons, the resilience of the entire fish population was critically compromised. When a powerful El Niño struck in the spring of 1972, the warm surface layer of water pushed the thermocline deep down. The cold, nutrient-rich water could no longer reach the surface. The result was an immediate collapse of phytoplankton. Anchovies began to die en masse or migrate south into colder waters. The population of seabirds, which depended entirely on these fish for survival, was drastically decimated, which also crippled the local guano industry. However, this regional collapse had global repercussions. The sudden shortage of fish meal, used as the primary feed for livestock in North America and Europe, triggered massive panic in commodity markets. Farmers were forced to switch en masse to soybean meal. This put immense pressure on American soybean stocks, which, combined with the Soviet Union's secret purchase of American grain, known as the Great Grain Robbery, resulted in a worldwide explosion of food prices. Late Victorian holocausts and the politics of hunger. If the year 1972 was an ecological and economic lesson, the events of the years 1876 to 1878 showed how El Niño, combined with political cynicism, could turn into a weapon of mass destruction. A scientific team led by climatologist Deepti Singh from Washington State University reconstructed the course of this historical catastrophe using tree ring analysis and historical logbooks. Singh's research revealed that from 1877 to 1878, the planet experienced the strongest and most persistent El Niño ever recorded by modern instruments. This climate extreme did not just strike India, it triggered synchronous droughts in northern China, northeastern Brazil, southern Africa, and Australia. This extreme drought was further compounded by the strongest positive phase of the Indian Ocean dipole on record and an exceptionally warm North Atlantic. Historian Mike Davis, in his groundbreaking book, Late Victorian Holocausts, argues that the tens of millions of victims were not the inevitable consequence of a natural drought, but rather the result of the forced integration of traditional agrarian economies into a London-centered global market system. In India, which was struck by a fatal failure of the monsoon, there was actually plenty of grain. However, the British colonial administration, led by Viceroy Lord Lytton, insisted on dogmatically adhering to the principles of laissez-faire capitalism and Malthusian population theory. Lytton refused to halt the export of grain from India. During the worst years of the drought, wheat exports to Great Britain actually surged from 3 million to 10 million tons annually, while Indian peasants starved to death directly alongside the railway tracks used to transport this grain to ports. The local famine relief commissioner, Sir Richard Temple, had previously been celebrated during the Bihar famine of 1873 to 1874 for a successful rescue operation in which he imported rice from Burma, resulting in only 23 deaths. However, the British press and the Treasury fiercely criticized him for extravagance and interfering with the free market. When the famine of 1876 broke out, Temple was determined to prove his fiscal discipline to the colonial budget. He established a brutal system of labor camps. Applicants had to pass a grueling physical strength test and travel more than 10 miles from home to prove they were genuinely starving. In these railway and canal construction camps, Temple introduced what became known as the Temple wage. This food ration was extremely inadequate. While the approved daily ration for an Indian prisoner at the time was approximately 3,800 calories, and the minimum intake recommended by health officials for a hard-working person was 2,500 calories. The Temple wage for starving laborers forced into hard work was set at just 1,627 calories per day. This ration was 123 calories lower than the food provided to inmates in the Nazi concentration camp of Buchenwald in the year 1944, and barely exceeded the basal metabolic rate of a person in a coma, which requires about 1,500 calories to survive without any movement. The temple wage did not provide enough energy to perform strenuous labor, resulting in an annualized mortality rate of up to 94% in the Indian labor camps. At the same time, the Anti-Charitable Contributions Act of 1877 was passed, which outlawed any private charity donations to the starving under threat of imprisonment so as not to disrupt the market price of grain. This fatal combination of record climate drought and colonial dogmatism claimed between 30 and 60 million lives globally from 1876 to 1878. The year 2026, Super El Niño in the era of warm oceans. On May 14, 2026, the NOAA Climate Prediction Center issued its official diagnostic discussion on this cycle. The probability of a new El Niño emerging between May and July of 2026 reached 82%, and for the winter season from December 2026 to February 2027, it skyrocketed to 96%. Climate models from the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts even indicate a 98% probability of an El Niño developing with a temperature anomaly exceeding 2 degrees Celsius. Why does this report trigger panic among climatologists? The answer comes from a new study led by Dr. Wenju Kai. His research proves that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have already permanently altered the Pacific environment. Even if global warming is successfully capped below 1.5 degrees Celsius in line with the Paris Agreement, the frequency of extreme El Niño events will double, rising from a historical average of 4.5 events per century to more than 10.4 events. This is because the oceans have accumulated a massive amount of heat that will take several decades to dissipate. The greatest danger of the year 2026, however, does not lie solely in the strength of El Niño itself, but in its starting point. Previous major El Niños, such as those in 1997 to 1998 or 2015 to 2016, began in a significantly cooler climate system. Today, however, this warming arrives at a moment when global ocean temperatures are already at unprecedented highs. This is a dangerous synergy where a natural oscillation collides with an artificially warmed atmosphere. The probability of this phenomenon's development evolves through various phases of intensity over the years 2026 and 2027. For the period from May to July of 2026, forecast models show an 82% probability of El Niño's onset, with a predominance of weak to moderate intensity. In the months from August to October of 2026, this probability rises above 85%, with a 72% chance of reaching moderate to strong intensity. The peak is expected between November 2026 and January 2027, when there is a 37% probability of El Niño reaching the very strong category. Finally, for the period from December 2026 to February 2027, models indicate a 96% probability of the phenomenon persisting, with a 31% chance of maintaining very strong intensity. Global cascading risks and future outlook. What will be the concrete consequences of this new cycle? Climatologists and economists predict severe systemic risks that could destabilize modern society. The first of these is the so-called coastal double whammy. Dr. William Sweet from NOAA warns of an unprecedented risk of high tide flooding along both the east and west coasts of North America. The thermal expansion of water combined with Kelvin waves will raise local sea levels, which, combined with decades of baseline sea level rise, will push tidal flooding deep inland even in the absence of storms. Another critical risk is a food supply collapse in Southeast Asia. In Malaysia and Indonesia, ongoing droughts are already disrupting rice production, forcing authorities to prepare cloud seeding operations. A potential weakening of the Indian monsoon could reduce rainfall to 92% of the long-term average, triggering an immediate surge in food prices across Asian markets. A third cluster of problems involves the destabilization of energy grids. Extreme heat waves will dramatically increase electricity demand for cooling, while droughts will lower river levels, crippling the cooling systems of nuclear power plants and the operation of hydroelectric facilities. A fourth severe threat is the mass destruction of coral reefs. Global warming, in combination with El Niño, already triggered massive coral bleaching in the year 2015. The 2026 to 2027 cycle is expected to definitively wipe out the remaining coral ecosystems in the tropical Pacific. Unlike the peasants of the year 1877, modern civilization holds a massive advantage in its hands: science. We know what is coming, and thanks to a global network of more than 4,000 Argo floats, we can measure it on a daily basis. However, this advantage is only as strong as our ability to learn from the past. Deepti Singh warns that although the social, political, and economic factors that led to the famines of the 19th century are different today, the interconnectedness of our global economy creates new types of vulnerabilities. The Super El Niño of the year 2026 will test the limits of modern agricultural technology, energy systems, and global solidarity. The question is no longer whether we can predict the catastrophe, but whether we are politically and economically mature enough to prevent it.